Jewish Mysticism, An Introduction to the Kabbalah by J. Abelson, 1913. Jewish Mysticism. It might strike the average reader as exceedingly odd that any attempt should be made at writing a book on Jewish mysticism. The prevailing opinion among theologians, as well as in the mind of the ordinary man, seems to be that Judaism and mysticism stand at the opposite poles of thought, and that, therefore, such a phrase as Jewish mysticism is a glaring and indefensible contradiction in terms. It is hoped that the contents of this little book will show the utter falsity of this view. What is this view, in the main, based upon? It is based upon the gratuitous assumption that the Old Testament and all the theological and religious literature produced by Jews in subsequent ages, as well as the general synagogue ritual, the public and private religious worship of the Jew, that all these are grounded on the unquestioning assumption of an exclusively transcendent God. The Jews, it is said, never got any higher than the notion of the old Jehovah, whose abode was in the highest of the seven heavens, and whose existence, although very, very real to the Jew, was yet of a kind so immeasurably far away from the scenes of earth that it could not possibly have that significance for the Jew which the God of Christianity has for the Christian. The Jew, it is said, could not possibly have that inward experience of God which was made possible to the Christian by the life of Jesus and the teaching of Paul. This is one erroneous assumption. A second is the following. The Pauline antithesis of law and faith has falsely stamped Judaism as a religion of unrelieved legalism, and mysticism is the irreconcilable enemy of legalism. The God of the Jew, it is said, is a lawgiver, pure and simple. The loyal and conscientious Jew is he who lives in the throes of an uninterrupted obedience to a string of laws which hedge him round on all sides. Religion is thus a mere outward, mechanical, and burdensome routine. It is one long bondage to a master whom no one has at any time seen or experienced. All spirituality is wanting. God is, as it were, a fixture, static. He never goes out of his impenetrable isolation. Hence, he can have no bond of union with anyone here below. Hence, further, he must be a stranger to the idea of love. There can be no such thing as a self-manifestation of a loving God. No movement of the divine spirit towards the human spirit, and no return movement of the human spirit to the divine spirit. There can be no fellowship with God, no opportunity for any immediate experiences by which the human soul comes to partake of God, no incoming of God into human life. And where there is none of these, there can be no mystical element. A third false factor in the judgment of Christian theologians upon Judaism is their insistence upon the fact that the intense and uncompromising national character of Judaism must of necessity be fatal to the mystical temperament. Mystical religion does, of course, transcend all the barriers which separate race from race and religion from religion. The mystic is a cosmopolitan, and to him, the differences between the demands and beliefs and observances of one creed and those of another are entirely obliterated in his one all-absorbing and all-overshadowing passion for union with reality. It is therefore quite true that if Judaism demands of its devotees that they should shut up their God in one sequestered, watertight compartment, it cannot at the same time be favorable to the quest pursued by the mystic. But as against this, it must be urged that Judaism in its evolution through the centuries has not been so hopelessly particularist as is customarily imagined. The message of the Old Testament on this head must be judged by the condition of things prevailing in the long epoch of its composition. The message of the rabbinical literature and of much of the Jewish medieval literature must similarly be judged. The Jew was the butt of the world's scorn. He was outcast, degraded, incapacitated, denied over so many of the innocent joys and advantages which are the rightful heritage of all the children of men, no matter what their distinctive race or creed might be. He retaliated by declaring, as a result of conviction, in his literature and in his liturgy, that is, his God could not by any chance be the God of the authors of all these acts of wickedness and treachery, idolatry, immorality, impurity, murder, persecution, hatred. The workers of all these must perforce be shut out from the divine presence. Hence, seeing that, in the sight of the Jew, the nations were the personification of these detestable vices, and seeing that the Jew, in all the pride of a long tradition, looked upon himself as invested with a spirit of especial sanctity, as entrusted with the mission of a holy and pure priesthood, one can quite easily understand how he came to regard the God of truth and mercy as first and foremost his God, and no one else's. But with all this, there are in all branches of Jewish literature gleams of a far wider, more tolerant, and universalist outlook. Instances will be quoted later. The fact that they existed shows that the germs of the universalism implied in mysticism were there, only they were crushed by the dead weight of a perverse worldly fate. The Jew certainly did, and could find God in his neighbor, a non-Jew, as well as in himself. And this ability is, and always was, a strong point of the mystics. Further, even if it be granted that there are in Judaism elements of a nationalism which can hardly be made to square with a high spirituality, this is no necessary bar to its possession of abiding and deeply ingrained mystical elements. Nationalism is an integral and vital part of the Judaism of the Old Testament and the rabbinical literature. It is bone of its bone, spirit of its spirit. It is so interfused with religion that it is itself religion. You cannot take up the old Judaism and break it up into pieces, saying, here are its religious elements, there are its national elements. The two are inextricably combined, warp and woof, of one texture. And thus it came about that, strange as it may appear to the modern mind, a halo of religious worth and of strong spirituality was thrown over beliefs and practices which, considered in and for themselves, are nothing more than national sentiments, national memories, and national aspirations. Such then being the case, the relation of Judaism to Jewish nationalism is the relation of a large circle to the smaller circle inscribed within it. The larger embraces the smaller. To come now to mysticism. The mystic differs from the ordinary religionist in that whereas the latter knows God through an objective revelation, whether in nature or as embodied in the Bible, which is really only second-hand knowledge, mediate, external, the record of other people's visions and experiences. The mystic knows God by contact of spirit with spirit. He has the immediate vision. He hears the still small voice speaking clearly to him in the silence of his soul. In this sense, the mystic stands quite outside the field of all the great religions of the world. Religion for him is merely his own individual religion, his own lonely, isolated quest for truth. He is solitary, a soul alone with God. But when we examine the lives and works of mystics, what do we usually find? We usually find that in spite of the intensely individualistic type of their religion, they are allied with some one particular religion of the world's religions. Their mystical experiences are colored and molded by some one dominant faith. The specific forms of their conceptions of God do not come from their own inner light only, but from the teachings which they imbibe from the external and traditional religion of their race or country. Thus, Christian mysticism has characteristics which are sui generis, So has Mohammedan mysticism, so has Hindu mysticism, and likewise Jewish mysticism. The method, the temperament, the spirit are very much the same in all of them, but the influence wielded over them by the nature and trend of each of the great dominant religions is a decisive one, and stamps its features on them in a degree which makes them most easily distinguishable from one another. Thus, Judaism, whatever be its composition or spiritual outlook, can certainly be a religion of mysticism. Its mysticism may be of a different order from that which we commonly expect, but this we shall see into later. I have thus far dealt with the misconstructions put upon Judaism and its mysticism by theologians outside the Jewish fold. Some early elements. Essenism. The Old Testament is the fountainhead of Judaism. Hence, if it is true, as is contended in a previous page, that the Old Testament contains mystical elements, then the starting point in any treatment of Jewish mysticism on historical or even semi-historical lines must be the Old Testament. But this course will not be adopted here. The Old Testament will be omitted, and for a reason which has already been hinted. The mysticism of the Old Testament is of an elementary, naive, and unconscious kind, whereas what this book is intended to show is the consciously elaborated professional mysticism of the Jews. What we get in the Old Testament are the groundwork and the scaffolding, the indispensable beginnings of the edifice, but not the edifice itself. Thus, it has much to say about the fatherhood of God. Here we have a basic conception of all mysticism. For the latter, in all its phases and stages, assumes the possibility of communion with some one who, while greater and more powerful than ourselves, is at the same time loving and benevolent and personally interested in us. You can only pray to one who hears. You can only feel love towards one who, you know, has loved you first. The Old Testament scintillates with sublime examples of men whose communion with God was a thing of intensest reality to them, and whose conviction of the, quote, nearness of the divine was beyond the slightest cavil. The sudden and unexpected inrushes of divine inspiration which seized the Old Testament prophets. Isaiah's vision of a God, quote, whose train filled the temple. An emblem of the all-inclusiveness of deity, of the presence and the working of an all-embracing spirit of life. The ecstasy of an Ezekiel lifted from off his feet by the Spirit and removed from one place to another. The fact of prophecy itself, the possession of spiritually endowment not vouchsafed to ordinary men, the endowment of a higher insight into the will of God. All these represent a stage of first-hand living religion to which the name of mysticism is rightly and properly applied. But they are no more than the preamble to the explicit, conscious, and pronouncedly personal type of Jewish mysticism which is the subject of the present book. The earliest beginnings of this mysticism are usually accredited by modern Jewish scholars to the Essenes. To say this is to put back Jewish mysticism to a very early date, for, according to the theory of Wellhausen, 1894, the Essenes, as well as the Pharisees, were offshoots of the Hasidim, quote, pious ones, of the pre-Maccabean era. But it is only a theory, and not an established historical fact. Seeing that the religious tenets of the Jews during the 3 centuries immediately preceding the birth of Christianity are veiled in considerable obscurity, and seeing also that the real meaning of the name Essenes, as well as their exact relations with the Pharisees, are points upon which there is anything but certainty. That is certain, however, 3 outstanding literary sources belonging to the first 2 or 3 Christian centuries, Philo, Josephus, some older portions of the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds, all have stray allusions, couched in varying phraseology, to certain sects or parties who differed in their mode of life from the general body of the Jews, and who were in possession of certain esoteric teachings of which those outside their ranks were uninformed. Thus Philo writes of them that they were eminently worshippers of God, not in the sense that they sacrifice living animals like the priests in the temple, but that they are anxious to keep their minds in a priestly state of holiness. They prefer to live in villages and avoid cities on account of the habitual wickedness of those who inhabit them, knowing as they do that just as foul air breeds disease, so there is danger of contracting an incurable disease of the soul from such bad associations. Again, in another of his works, Philo says, of natural philosophy, they study only that which pertains to the existence of God and the beginning of all things. Otherwise, they devote all their attention to ethics, using as instructors the laws of their fathers, which, without the outpouring of the divine Spirit, the human mind could not have devised. For, following their ancient traditions, they obtain their philosophy by means of allegorical interpretations. Of the love of God, they exhibit myriads of examples, inasmuch as they strive for a continued, uninterrupted life of purity and holiness. They avoid swearing and falsehood, and they declare that God causes only good and no evil whatsoever. No one possesses a house absolutely as his own, one which does not at the same time belong to all, for in addition to living together in companies, their houses are open also to their adherents coming from other quarters. They have one storehouse for all, the same diet. Their garments belong to all in common, and their meals are taken in common. Josephus speaks of the Essenes in similar terms. The points to be noted in both the aforementioned authors are a. The great stress laid on fellowship, amounting to a kind of communism. B. Their removal from the general people by reason of their higher sanctity. C. Their devotion to the knowledge of the existence of God and the beginning of all things. D. Their love of allegorical interpretation. Although it is exceedingly difficult to know what the rabbinic term equivalent to Essene is, it is not hard to deduce from names and phrases scattered throughout the rabbinic records a theory that there existed as early as the first Christian centuries either a distinct sect of Jews or individual Jews here and there who combined mystical speculation with an ascetic mode of life. A similar phenomenon is observable in the history of the early Christian church. There was a life of primitive and austere fellowship, a group here, a group there, gathered together with no other motive than that of gaining a greater hold on the spiritual life than was prevalent in the ordinary circles of the people. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and soul. And not one of them said that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common, for neither were there among them any that lacked. For as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and distribution was made unto each according as any one had need. Acts 4:32 through 35. They seem to have lived on the borderland of an unusual ecstasy, experiencing extraordinary invasions of the divine, hearing mystic sounds, seeing mystic visions, which to them were the direct and immediate revelations of the deepest and most sacred truths. Illustrations of similar experiences in the bosom of the early synagogue, as presented in the rabbinic records, are the following. There are several heterogeneous passages which speak of the existence within the ancient temple at Jerusalem of a special apartment called the Chamber of the Silent Ones. According to the statement of Tosfta Shechem, there were to be found in some cities of Palestine and Babylon men known as Hashaim, who reserved a special room in their house for depositing in it a charity box into which money for the poor could be put and withdrawn with the utmost silence. It was collected and distributed by men appointed for the purpose. As it was all done with the strictest secrecy, it looks as though there was a kind of communism among the members of the order. The special chamber in the temple, as mentioned above, was also a place where gifts for the poor were deposited in secret and withdrawn for distribution in secret. Two facts seem to demonstrate that these Hashaim were a small mystical sect. Firstly, they are given the special appellation, quote, fearers of sin. They were thus marked off by an extra sanctity from the body of the people, and the student of the rabbinic literature knows that whenever a special title is accorded to a group or sect on the grounds of special holiness, this holiness is always of an exceptionally high order. It is the holiness of men in touch with the divine, and as has just been remarked, their enthusiasm for doing good seems to have been grounded on a kind of austere fellowship that reigned among them, impelling them to do their work unseen by the madding crowd. Secondly, the idea of silence or secrecy was frequently employed by the early rabbis in their mystical exegesis of Scripture. A typical illustration is the following passage from the Midrash. Simon, son of Jehozadak, asked Samuel, son of Nahaman, two Palestinian teachers of the beginning of the 3rd century AD. Simon said unto him, Seeing that I have heard concerning thee that thou art an adept in the Haggadah, tell me whence the light was created. He replied, It tells us that the Holy One, blessed be He, enwrapped himself in a garment, and the brightness of his splendor lit up the universe from end to end. He, the sage who just replied, said this in a whisper, upon which the other sage retorted, Why dost thou tell this in a whisper, seeing that it is taught clearly in a scriptural verse in Psalm? Who coverest thyself with light as with a garment? Just as I have myself had it whispered unto me, replied he, even so have I whispered it unto thee. Another instance of what looks like a sect of esoteric teachers among the Jews of the first centuries is the Vatican, men of firm principles. Their mysticism seems to have clustered mostly round the sentiments and outward conduct governing prayer. Indeed, throughout rabbinical literature, the true suppliant before God is in many cases a mystic. Only the mystic mood is the true prayerful mood. There is a discussion in the Mishnah of Barachoth as to what is the earliest moment in the dawn at which the Shema being a technical name for Deuteronomy, may be read. Upon this, the comment is made that arranged the time for prayer in such a way as to enable them to finish the reading of the Shema at the exact moment of sunrise. Another great rabbinic commentator, Solomon Isaac, said, Men who were meek and carried out the commandment from pure love. It must be borne in mind that throughout Jewish theology, meekness, anava, stands for something immensely higher than the moral connotation, which we customarily attribute to the virtue. It signifies a level of religious devoutness, which it is not given to everyone to reach. To carry out a commandment from pure love means, in Jewish theology of all ages, to attain a high stage of mystic elation, which can only be arrived at as the result of a long preliminary series of arduous efforts in the upward path. To recite the Shema is, as the rabbis frequently say, to take upon oneself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And the phrase, kingdom of heaven has decidedly mystical associations, as we shall see later. Hence one may plausibly conclude that the Vatican were a brotherhood whose dominant feature was a simplicity of living combined with a degree of earnest scrupulousness in prayer amounting to an adoration, a love of the divine, such as is experienced by the mystics of all nations of all times. A similar description might be applied to the members of what apparently was another esoteric order of those days, the Venuum, the lowly chaste ones. As a matter of fact, the rabbinic records are too vague and disconnected to enable scholars to say with any certainty whether these Zen-uam were an independent sect or whether the word is merely another term denoting either or both of the other fellowships already alluded to. They bear the hallmark of all ancient and medieval Jewish mysticism in respect of the emphasis laid out by them on the importance of the letters comprising the divine names in Hebrew, as well as upon certain manipulations of the Hebrew alphabet. The following passage occurs in Kedushin. Judah said in the name of Rabbi Abba Arika, a Babylonian teacher of the 3rd century AD, the name of 42 letters can only be entrusted by us to him who is modest and meek in the midway of life, not easily provoked to anger, temperate, and free from vengeful feelings. He who understands it is cautious with it, keeps it in purity, is loved above, and is liked here below. He is revered by his fellow men. He is heir to 2 worlds, this world and the world to come. It is interesting to quote here the comment on this rabbinic passage made by the Spanish Hebrew philosopher Moses Maimonides in his great work, The Guide of the Perplexed. He says, "There was also a name of 42 letters known among them. Every intelligent person knows that one word of 42 letters is impossible, but it was a phrase of several words which had together 42 letters. There is no doubt that the words had such a meaning as to convey a correct notion of the essence of God in the way we have stated. Many believe that the 42 letters are merely to be pronounced mechanically, that by the knowledge of these, without any further interpretation, they can attain to those exalted ends. On the contrary, it is evident that all this exalted preparation aims at a knowledge of the metaphysics and includes ideas which constitute the secrets of the law, as we have explained. Maimonides, it should be remembered, was a rationalist and anti-mystic, as much of the old rabbinic cosmological mysticism, which was looked upon as a serious mystical speculation by many of his literary contemporaries, was dubbed by him as metaphysics or physics. But to return to our subject at hand, the best insight into the origin and implication of these 42 letters is afforded us by the Talmudic passage last quoted, where we are told that in the last days of the temple, the decadent priests were deemed unworthy to pronounce the divine name in their official benedictions, and a name consisting of 12 letters was substituted. What this name was is nowhere given in the rabbinic records. As time went on, it was deemed inadvisable to entrust even this 12-lettered name to every priest. It was taught only to an elect sect among them, who, when chanting the benedictions in the general company of all the priests, used to swallow its pronunciation, to make it inaudible in order not to divulge it. The 42-letter name probably arose in similar circumstances, but whether the secrets of it were confined to a greater or smaller circle than that in which the 12-letter name was known is by no means apparent. Let it only be said here, as it is a subject to which we shall return later on, that in the elaborated systems of the medieval Kabbalists, these many-lettered names of God, not only 42 but also 45 and 72 letters, are the pivots on which huge masses of most curious mystical lore turns. The 10 Sephirot have close connections with these doctrines of letters, secret doctrines about the divine nature, about creation, about the relations subsisting between God and the universe. Reference must here be made to what appears to be another order of Jewish mystics in the opening centuries of the Christian era. The Mishnah Tractate Sukkah speaks of the Hasidim, Anshe Ma'aseh, saints and miracle workers, who, at the joyous feasts of the water drawing at the temple during tabernacles, used to dance and perform certain acrobatic feats with lighted torches. The allusions are very vaguely worded, and it is hazardous to deduce any hard and fast theories, but so much may be said that being mentioned together in the same Mishnah passage just quoted, and being mentioned in close succession in another old passage of the Mishnah, it is more than probable that they belonged to one and the same sect. Again, the phrase Anshe Ma'aseh, as well as the singular form of the first word, is frequently used in rabbinic to mean miracle worker, although in the biblical Hebrew it would signify man of action. There is a passage in Barakoth 18b, which gives a weird description of the experience of a Hasid who heard from, quote, behind the curtain certain secrets hidden from ordinary men, and the student of rabbinics knows how many a rabbi of these early centuries gifted with the mystic temperament wielded a semi-miraculous power of foretelling the future or of creating something out of nothing. The vast literature of rabbinic angelology and demonology shows the same features, upon which Conybeare, in the Jewish Quarterly Review, has thrown considerable light in his translation of the Testament of Solomon. It is a moot point as to whether these Hasidim are the lineal descendants of the saintly party known by that name in the Maccabean epoch. The point, however, which clearly emerges is that a certain esoteric wisdom and capacity for doing things unknown to the multitudes was vouchsafed to certain bodies of men who, by the superior purity of their living, by their unabated devotion to the things of the Spirit, and by their cultivation of a kind of brotherhood in which simplicity, single-mindedness, and charity were the reigning virtues, were enabled to enjoy a living in the world of the unseen. One further matter in conclusion. The interests of historical accuracy demand that, as has been already pointed out, the student should be in no hurry to say that these esoteric sects, whose beliefs are so vaguely and fragmentarily described in the rabbinic literature, are to be identified with the Essenes described in the writings of Philo and Josephus. Resemblances there certainly are, but there are differences too, and the rabbinic allusions are too disjointed to enable one to form an impression, even an inexact impression, leave alone an exact one, of the lives and thoughts of these mystic gatherings. Philo and Josephus paint a complete picture. The Talmud and Midrashim give but stray and elusive hints. For one thing, the Essenes practiced celibacy. Marriage must necessarily dissolve the fellowship characterizing the order. The rabbinic record gives no hint of the duty of celibacy. On the contrary, marriage was held to promote a far higher sanctity than celibacy, but the rabbis tolerated some exceptional cases of celibacy, so that it is difficult to speak categorically. Again, the center of gravity of Essenic religion seems to have been the cultivation of the highest ethics. They stressed inward religion as demanded by the Mosaic Code, but with the exception of a reverence for the holiness of the Sabbath, they were comparatively unconcerned with the outward religious duties incumbent upon the Jews of that time. Thus they made little or nothing of the sacrifices. Doubtless was this emphasis on the allegorical interpretation of Scripture, but it was otherwise with the early mystics of the rabbinic literature. Although living in an atmosphere of mystery and looking to the divine secret to unroll itself at any moment, they yet never overlooked the claims of institutional religion. They never flouted the ceremonial side of Judaism. They were inflexible upholders of the law and its associated traditions. The same phenomenon is, of course, seen in the history of Christian mysticism, where the first-hand, inward, individualized experiences of the ground truths of religion are conformed to the prevailing and accredited dogmas of Christianity. There were mystics among the Pharisees as well as among the Essenes, and yet we are told that the most spiritually gifted among the former, who constituted the Haburah fellowship, were they who were most scrupulous about the giving of the priestly dues, a purely external religious duty based on the legalism of the Pentateuch. Indeed, this blending of legalism with spirituality, this consistent and successful interweaving of the formalism of tradition with the mysticism of the individual, is an arresting feature of Jewish theology in all ages. In fine, as must be apparent from the general trend and contents of this book, the whole of Jewish mysticism is really nothing but a commentary on the Jewish Bible, an attempt to pierce through to its most intimate and truest meaning. And what is the Bible to the Jew but the admonisher to be loyal to the traditions of his fathers? Only then will he find God, when he is convinced that he was found of those of his race who sought him in an earlier day. Chariot mysticism, the Merkaba mysticism. The first chapter of Ezekiel has played a most fruitful part in the mystical speculations of the Jews. The lore of the heavenly throne chariot in some one or other of its multitudinous implications is everywhere to be met with. Whence Ezekiel derived these baffling conceptions of the deity, and what historical or theological truths he meant to portray by means of them, are themes with which the scholars of the Old Testament have ever busied themselves. But the Jewish mystic sought no rationalistic explanation of them. He took them as they were, in all their mystery, in all their strange and inexplicable fantasy, in all their weird aloofness from the things and ideas of the everyday life. He sought no explanation of them because he was assured that they stood forth something which did not need explaining. He felt instinctively that the Merkaba typified the human longing for the sight of the divine presence and companionship with it. To attain this end was to him the acme of all spiritual life. Ezekiel's image of Yod He Vav He riding upon the chariot of the living creatures, accompanied by the sights and voices, movements and upheavals in earth and heaven, lying outside the range of the deepest ecstatic experiences of all other Old Testament personages, was for the Jewish mystic a real opening and unveiling of the innermost and impenetrable secrets locked up in the interrelation of the human and the divine. It was interpreted as a sort of divine self-opening, self-condescension to man. The door is flung wide open so that man, at the direct invitation of God, can come to the secret for which he longs and seeks. This idea is a supreme factor in the mystic life of all religions. The soul is urged on to seek union with God only because it feels that God has first gone out on his own initiative and uninvited to seek union with it. The human movement from within is but a response to a larger divine movement from without. The call has come, the answer must come. The chariot, Merkaba, was thus a kind of mystic way leading up to the final goal of the soul, or more precisely, it was the mystic instrument, the vehicle by which one was carried direct into the halls of the unseen. It was the aim of the mystic to be a Merkaba rider, so that he might be enabled, while still in the trammels of the flesh, to mount up to his spiritual Eldorado, whether, as has been suggested, the uncanny imagery of the chariot mysticism lore is to be sought for its origin in the teachings of Mithraism, or as has been suggested in certain branches of Mohammedan mysticism. One can quite clearly see how its governing idea is based on a conception general to all the mystics, that the quest for the ultimate reality is a kind of pilgrimage, and the seeker is a traveler going towards his home in God. It was remarked on a previous page that the mystic neither asked nor waited for any rationalistic explanation of the Merkaba mysteries. He felt that they summarized for him the highest pinnacle of being, towards the realization of which he must bend his energies without stint. But yet, from certain stray and scattered rabbinic remarks, one takes leave to infer that there existed in the early Christian centuries a small sect of Jewish mystics, the elect of the elect, to whom certain measures of instruction were given in these themes. There was an esoteric science of the Merkaba. What its content was, we can only dimly guess from the rabbinic sources. It appears to have been a confused angelology, one famous angel, Metatron, playing a conspicuous part. Much more is to be found in the early Enoch literature, as well as from quite other points of view, in the medieval Kabbalah. Let us give some illustrative sayings from the rabbinic literature. In the Mishnah, it is said, quote, "It is forbidden to explain the first chapter of Genesis to two persons, but it is only to be explained to one by himself. It is forbidden to explain the Merkaba even to one by himself, unless he be a sage and of an original turn of mind." End quote. In a passage in T.B. Haggika, the words are added, quote, "But it is permitted to divulge to him, to one in the case of the first chapters of Genesis, the first words of the chapters. End quote. In the same passage, another rabbi, Ze'era of the 3rd century AD, remarks with a greater stringency, "We may not divulge even the first words of the chapters, neither of Genesis nor Ezekiel, unless it be to a chief of the Bet Din, or to one whose heart is tempered by age or responsibility." Yet another teacher of the same century declares in the same connection, "We may not divulge the secrets of the Torah to any but to him to whom the verse in Isaiah applies, the captain of 50, and the honorable man, and the counselor, and the cunning artificer, and the eloquent orator." The rabbis understood these terms to mean distinction in a knowledge and practice of the Torah. This insistence upon a high level of moral and religious fitness as the indispensable prelude to a knowledge of the Merkabah, chariot mysticism, has its counterpart in the mysticism of all religions. The organic life, the self, conscious and unconscious, must be molded and developed in certain ways. There must be an education, moral, physical, emotional, a psychological adjustment by stages of the mental states which go to the makeup of full mystic consciousness. As Evelyn Underhill says in Mysticism, page 107, quote, "Mysticism shows itself not merely as an attitude of mind and heart, but as a form of organic life. It is a remaking of the whole character on high levels in the interests of transcendental life." End quote. That the rabbis were fully alive to the importance of this self-discipline is seen by a remark of theirs in TB Haggadah 13a as follows. "A certain youth was once explaining the Hashmal, Ezekiel 27, translated amber in the AV, when fire came forth and consumed him. When the question is asked, why was this? The answer is, quote, his time had not yet come, end quote. This cannot but mean that his youthful age had not given him the opportunities for the mature self-culture necessary to the mystic apprehension. The Hashmal, by the way, was interpreted by the rabbis as a shortened form of the full phrase Heyoit eshe me male lot, meaning the living creatures of fire speaking, or b a shortened form of itim hash oth ve itim me male lot, meaning they who at times were silent and at times speaking. In the literature of the medieval Kabbalah, the Hashmal belongs to the Yetziratic world, the abode of angels, presided over by Metatron, who was changed into fire, and the spirits of men are there too. According to a modern biblical commentator, the celebrated Russian Hebraist M.L. Malbim, the word signifies the Hayoit, living creatures of Ezekiel, which are the abode or camp of the Shekinah, the divine presence, where there is the still small voice. It is they, the Hayoit, who receive the divine effluence from above and disseminate it to the Hayoit, who are the movers of the wheels of Ezekiel's chariot. Many more passages of a like kind might be quoted in support of the view that the attainment of a knowledge of the Merkaba was a hard quest beset with ever so many impediments, that it presupposed, on the one hand, an exceptional measure of self-development, and on the other, an extraordinary amount of self-repression and self-renouncement. But the mention of fire in the preceding paragraph leads us to the consideration of an aspect of the Merkaba which brings the latter very much into line with the description of mystical phenomena in literature generally. Everyone knows how the image of fire dominates so much of mysticism, even the mysticism of Dante. The medieval Christian mystics, Catherine of Genoa, Jacob Bohemia, and others, appeal constantly to the same figure for the expression of their deepest thoughts on the relations between man and the Godhead. The choice of the metaphor probably rests on the fact that fire can be adopted to symbolize either or both of the following truths. A. The brightness illumination which comes when the goal has been reached, when the quest for the ultimate reality has at last been satisfied, or B, the all-penetrating, all-encompassing, self-diffusing force of fire is such a telling picture of the mystic union of the soul and God. The two are interpenetrated, fused into being one state of being. The soul is red hot with God, who at the same time, like fire, holds the soul in his grip, dwells in it. Examples are the following. In the Midrash Rabbah on Canticles 12, it is said, Ben Azai, a famous rabbi of the 2nd century AD, was once sitting, expounding the Torah. Fire surrounded him. They went and told Rabbi Akiba, saying, O Rabbi, Ben Azai is sitting expounding the Torah, and fire is lighting him up on all sides. Upon this, Rabbi Akiba went to Ben Azai and said unto him, I hear that thou wert sitting expounding the Torah with the fire playing round about thee. Yes, it is so, replied he. Wert thou then, retorted Akiba, engaged in unraveling the secret chambers of the Merkaba? No, he replied. It is not germane here to go into what the sage said he really was engaged in doing. The quotation sufficiently shows how in the 2nd century AD the imagery of fire was traditionally associated with esoteric culture. Here is another instance. Sukkah 28a. Hillel the Elder, 30 BC, had 80 disciples. 30 of them were worthy enough for the Shekinah to rest upon them. 30 of them were worthy enough for the sun to stand still at their bidding. The other 20 were of average character. The greatest among them all was Jonathan, son of Uziel, 1st century AD. The smallest among them all was Johanan, son of Zechariah, and of 1st century AD. The latter, smallest though he was acquainted with every conceivable branch of both exoteric and esoteric lore. He knew the talk of the ministering angels, and the talk of the demons, and the talk of the palm trees, Decalam. He knew also the lore of the Merkaba, such being the measure of the knowledge possessed by the smallest, shows how great must have been the measure of the knowledge possessed by the greatest, Jonathan, son of Uziel. When the latter was sitting and studying the Torah, presumably the esoteric lore of the angels and the Merkaba, every bird that flew above him was burnt by fire. These latter words are the description of the ecstatic state. the moments of exaltation, the indescribable peace and splendor which the soul of the mystic experiences when, disentangling itself from the darkness of illusion, it reaches the light of reality, the condition so aptly phrased by the psalmist, who said, quote, "For with thee is the fountain of life, in thy light shall we see light." The bird flying in the environment of this unrestrained light must inevitably be consumed by the fire of it. The monument which Jonathan, son of Uziel, has left us in perpetuation of his mystical tendencies is his usage of the term memra, word, to denote certain phases of divine activity. In the Aramaic paraphrase to the prophets which ancient Jewish tradition assigned to his authorship, but which modern research has shown to be but the foundation on which the extant Aramaic paraphrase to the prophets rests. Another illustration of the mystic vision of light consequent on the rapture created by an initiation into the Merkaba mysteries is related in TB Hagigah 14b. It says as follows: Johanan, son of Zakaiah, was once riding on an ass, and Rabbi Eliezer, son of Arak, was on an ass behind him. The latter rabbi said to the former, "O master, teach me a chapter of the Merkaba mysteries." "No," replied the master, "have I not already informed thee that the Merkaba may not be taught to any man by himself unless he be a sage and of an original turn of mind?" "Very well then," replied Eliezer, son of Arak, "wilt thou give me leave to tell thee a thing which thou hast taught me?" "Yes," replied Johanan, son of Zakaiah, "say it." Forthwith the master dismounted from his ass, wrapped himself up in a garment, and sat upon a stone beneath an olive tree. "Why, O master, hast thou dismounted from thy ass?" asked the disciple. "Is it possible," replied he, "that I will ride upon my ass at the moment when thou art expounding the mysteries of the Merkaba, and the Shekinah is with us, and the ministering angels are accompanying us?" Forthwith Eliezer, son of Arak, opened his discourse on the mysteries of the Merkaba, and no sooner had he begun than fire came down from heaven and encompassed all the trees of the field, which with one accord burst into song. What song? It was, "Praise the Lord from the earth, ye dragons and all the deeps, fruitful trees and all cedars, praise ye the Lord." Upon this an angel cried out from the fire, saying, "Truly these, even these, are the secrets of the Merkaba." Rabbi Johanan, son of Zakaiah, then rose and kissed his disciples upon the forehead, saying, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who hath given unto Abraham our father a son, who is able to understand and search and discourse upon the mysteries of the Merkaba." When these things were told to Rabbi Joshua, another disciple of Johanan, the latter said one day, when walking with Rabbi Jose, the priest, another disciple of Johanan, "Let us likewise discourse about the Merkaba." Rabbi Joshua opened the discourse. It was a day in the height of summer. The heavens became a knot of thick clouds, and something like a rainbow was seen in the clouds, and the ministering angels came in companies to listen, as men do to hear wedding music. Rabbi Jose, the priest, went and told his master of it, who exclaimed, "Happy are ye, happy is she that bare you, blessed are thy eyes that beheld these things. Indeed, I saw myself with you these things in a dream seated upon Mount Sinai, and I heard a heavenly voice exclaiming, 'Ascend hither, ascend hither. Large banqueting halls and fine couches are in readiness for you. You and your disciples and your disciples' disciples are destined to be in the third set.'" The third of the three classes of angels who, as the rabbis taught, stand continually before the Shekinah, singing psalms and anthems. There are several points which need making clear in this remarkable passage. The objection to discuss the Merkaba while sitting on an animal's back, and the fact of sitting upon a stone under an olive tree point to the necessary physical and temperamental self-discipline, which is the sine qua non of the mystic's equipment in all ages and among all nations. He must not be set high on the ass, lest his heart be lifted up too. He must be cleansed of every vestige of pride, lowly, and of a contrite spirit. It has been mentioned in the previous chapter how meekness was one of the unfailing qualities of the Zenuim. The proud man, said the rabbis, crowds out the feet of the Shekinah. Whosoever is haughty will finally fall into Gehinnom. Pride to the rabbis was the most terrible pitfall in the path of religious life. It is opposite humility, which is the starting point of all virtue. If such was the premium placed upon meekness insofar as it concerned the life of the ordinary Jew, how enormous must have been its importance for the life of the mystic, for him who aimed at knowing eternal truth. Everything that savors of evil, of imperfection, of sin, everything must vanish. The primary means of this self-purification is the culture of humility. The remark that the Shekinah is with us and the ministering angels are accompanying us emphasizes two salient features of rabbinic mysticism. Firstly, the Shekinah is the transcendent, eminent God of Israel. Israel's environment was saturated with the Shekinah, whose unfailing companionship the Jew enjoyed in all the lands of his dispersion. Even at the time when they are unclean, does the Shekinah dwell with them, runs a passage in TB Yoma 57a. How unique, how surpassingly vivid must have been the consciousness of the accompanying Shekinah presence to the Merkaba initiates, to those who had raised themselves so high above the level of the ordinary crowd by the pursuit of an ideal standard of self-perfection. Secondly, the ministering angels play a large part in all Merkaba lore, as is seen from the following rabbinic comment. Ezekiel 1:15 says, "Now, as I beheld the living creatures, behold one wheel upon the earth by the living creatures with his four faces." Rabbi Eliezer said, "There is one angel who stands upon earth, but whose head reaches to the living creatures. His name is Sandalphon. He is higher than his neighbor to the extent of 500 years' journey. He stands behind the Merkaba, wreathing coronets for his master." Another passage reads, "Day by day, ministering angels are created from the stream of fire. They sing a song to God and then pass away. As it is said, they are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness." Lamentations 3:23. From each word that comes forth from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he, there is created one angel, as it is said, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the hosts of them by the breath of his mouth. Psalm 33:6. The rabbis obviously understood the phrase, quote, "the host of them," quote, to refer not as we suppose to the paraphernalia of the heavens, for example, stars, planets, etc., but to the angelic worlds. The idea of the Word of God becoming transformed into an angel and hence accomplishing certain tangible tasks among men here on earth bears strong resemblances to the Logos of Philo as well as to the prologue of the fourth Gospel. the Gospel of John. The phrase to listen as men do to hear wedding music, or literally the quote, music of bride and bridegroom, end quote, is reminiscent of the large mass of rabbinic mysticism catered around the love overtures of bride and bridegroom in the Book of Canticles. The book on the rabbinic interpretation teaches the great truth of a spiritual marriage between the human and the divine, a betrothal between God and Israel. In 10 places in the Old Testament, says Canticles Rabbah 4:10, are the Israelites designated as a bride, 6 here, the Book of Canticles, and 4 in the Prophets, and in 10 corresponding passages is God represented as arrayed in garments which display the dignity of manhood in the ideal bridegroom. To the minds of the rabbis, the superabundant imagery of human love in marriage, which distinguishes Canticles from all other books of the Old Testament, was the truest symbol of the way in which human Israel and his divine Father were drawn near to one another. The intimate and secret experiences of the soul of the Jew, the rapturous of its intercourse with God in senses which no outsider could understand, were best reflected in the language of that august and indefinable passion which men call love. The remark, ascend hither, large banqueting halls and fine couches are in readiness for you, points to another prominent phase of rabbinic mysticism. It was strongly believed that the pious could, by means of a life led on the highest plane, free themselves from the trammels that bind the soul to the body and enter the heavenly paradise. The idea was obviously a development of a branch of Old Testament theology, but the latter gets no further than the conception that heaven may be reached without dying, the person translated thither having finished their earthly career. The experiences of Enoch, Genesis 24, and Elijah, 2 Kings 2:11, are illustrations. A development of the doctrine is the thought that certain favored saints of history are, after death and when in heaven, given instruction concerning the doings of men and the general course of events here below. The apocalyptic literature, see especially Apocalypse of Baruch by Dr. Charles, deals somewhat largely in this idea, and there are traces of it in the rabbinical literature. But these saints, however true the teachings and revelations vouchsafed to them may eventually have turned out to be, are dead as far as the world is concerned. A further development is seen in the theory that certain pious men may temporarily ascend into the unseen, and having seen and learnt the deepest mysteries, may return to earth again. These were the mystics who, by training themselves to a life of untarnished holiness, were able to fit themselves for entering a state of ecstasy, to behold visions and hear voices which brought them into direct contact with the divine life. They were the students of the Merkaba who, as a result of their peculiar physical and mental makeup, were capable of reaching the goal of their quest. There were 4 men, says the Talmud, who entered paradise. They were Rabbi Akiba, Ben Azai, Ben Zomo, and Elisha Abuha. End of the 1st century and beginning of the 2nd century. Although this passage is one of the puzzles of the Talmud and is variously interpreted, we may quite feasibly lay it down that the reference here is to one of those waking visits to the invisible world which fall within the experiences of all mystics in all ages, fragments of what was a large literature of the later rabbinical epoch from about the 7th to the 11th century, usually known as the Gaonic epoch, have descended to us. Of these, one branch is the Hekolat, the halls, which are supposed to have originated with the mystics of the aforementioned period, who called themselves Yored Merkaba, riders in the chariot. As Dr. Louis Ginsberg says, see Art Ascension in Jewish Encyclopedia, Volume 2, these mystics were able by various manipulations to enter into a state of auto-hypnosis in which they declare they saw heavens open before them and beheld its mysteries. It was believed that he only could undertake this Merkaba ride who was in possession of all religious knowledge, observed all the commandments and precepts, and was almost superhuman in the purity of his life. This, however, was regarded usually as a matter of theory, and less perfect men attempted, by fasting and prayer, to free their senses from the impressions of the outer world, and succeeded in entering into this state of ecstasy in which they recounted their heavenly visions. Much of this belief survives in modern Jewish mysticism, whose chief representatives, known as Hasidim, are to be found in Russia, Poland, and Hungary. Although it was stated above that the large volume of this phase of mystic literature originated in the period from the 7th to the 11th century, modern research has clearly proved that its roots go back to a very much earlier date. In fact, it is very doubtful whether its origin is to be looked for at all in the bosom of early Judaism. Mithra worship is now taken by scholars to account for much of it, but it is hazardous to venture any final opinion. It must never be forgotten that the first chapter of Ezekiel worked wonders on the old Hebrew imagination. Commentaries on almost every word in the chapter were composed wholesale. In all likelihood, the mysticism of the Merkaba writers is a syncretism. Mithraic conceptions in vogue were foisted on to the original Jewish interpretations, and in combination with Neoplatonism, there was evolved this branch of Jewish mysticism, which, though by no means abundant in the Talmud and the Midrashim, occupies a considerable place in the ideas of the medieval Kabbalah, as well as in the tenets of the modern Hasidim. The soul. As in all systems of mysticism, the soul plays a towering part in the theology of the Zohar. Mysticism's center of gravity is the close kinship between the human and the divine. And the only avenue through which this kinship can become real to us is the soul. The soul, as a spiritual entity playing the highest of high parts in man's relation with the unseen, is not a conspicuous element of either the Old Testament or the Talmudic Midrashic writings, and the critics of Judaism have a way of saying harsh things about that religion on the grounds of its deficiency in this respect. But the shortcoming is amply atoned for by the large part assigned to the function of the soul in all branches of the Kabbalah. That the Zohar is a debtor to a double source, the Talmudic teachings and the teachings of the Neoplatonists, is very apparent from its treatment of the soul. A passage from the former reads as follows: just as the soul fills the body, so God fills the world. Just as the soul bears the body, so God endures the world. Just as the soul sees but is not seen, so God sees but is not seen. Just as the soul feeds the body, spiritually, intellectually, so God gives food to the world. The predominant influence of the soul over the body as overflown in all its parts by the soul and dependent upon it for the source of its life, These are the implications of the passage just quoted, and they are the substratum of the Zoharic ideas of the soul. Neoplatonism gave to the Zohar the idea of the soul as an emanation from the, quote, overmind of the universe. There was originally one universal soul, or oversoul, which, as it were, broke itself up and encased itself in individual bodies. All individual souls are hence fragments of the oversoul, so that although they are distinct from one another, they are in reality one. Thus, to quote the Zohar, quote, "At the time when God desired to create the universe, it came in his will before him, and he formed all the souls which were destined to be allotted to the children of men. The souls were all before him in the forms which they were afterwards destined to bear inside the human body. God looked at each one of them, and he saw that many of them would act corruptly in the world. When the time of each arrived, it was summoned before God, who said to it, 'Go to such and such a part of the universe, and clothe thyself in such and such a body.' But the soul replied, 'O sovereign of the universe, I am happy in my present world, and I desire not to leave it for some other place where I shall be enslaved and become soiled.' Then the Holy One, blessed be he, replied, 'From the day of thy creation, thou hast had no other destiny than to go into the universe whither I send thee.' The soul, seeing that it must obey, sorrowfully took the way to earth and came to dwell in our midst." End quote. There are more than one echo of Plotinus, the mastermind of Neoplatonism, in this Zoharic extract. The world coming up in his will before him is the teaching about God thinking out the original patterns of all things, the first manifestation of God being thought. The souls were all before him in the forms which they were afterwards destined to bear, is clearly an allusion to the splitting up of the oversoul so that its fragments might get embodied in individuals as Plotinus taught. But although the Zohar, like Plotinus, draws a distinction between lower souls, quote, "they who would act corruptly in the world," end quote, and higher souls, it makes every soul descend into some body. Quote, "The lower soul desires a body and lives in the stage of sense. The higher soul, on the other hand, transcends the body, rides upon it, as the fish is in the sea or the plant is in the air. This higher soul never absolutely leaves its home. Its being is not here, but yonder." Or, in the language of Plotinus, the soul always leaves something of itself above. Rufus M. Jones, Studies in Mystical Religion, page 74. According to the Zohar, while there are distinctions there too between superior and inferior souls, as is shown by their belonging to a higher or lower sephira, they must all descend to earth and unite with the body, returning all of them at death to their fountainhead, God. The Zohar is, after all, but a commentary on the Hebrew Bible, and however much it may at times forsake the traditional Jewish pathways in favor of alien philosophies, it is always strictly conservative where the fundamental axioms of the Jewish faith are concerned. That every body possesses a soul, which in its pristine form is, quote, pure, that recompense in an afterlife awaits it on a scale commensurate with its deserts, in an impregnable tenet of Judaism. The Zohar, wherever it may wander, may come back to this central point. The soul is a trinity. It is comprised of three elements:
Neshama, the rational element, which is the highest phase of existence. Ruah, the moral element, the seat of good and evil, the ethical qualities. Nefesh, the gross side of spirit, the vital element, which is en rapport with the body, and the mainspring of all the movements, instincts, and cravings of the physical life. There is a strong reflection of Platonic psychology in these three divisions or powers of the soul. More than one medieval Jewish theologian was a Platonist, and in all probability the Zohar is a debtor to these. The three divisions of the soul are emanations from the Sephirot. The Neshama, which, as has been said, is the soul in its most elevated and sublimest sense, emanates from the Sephirah of wisdom. The Ruah, which denotes the soul in its ethical aspect, emanates from the Sephirah of beauty. The Nefesh, which is the animal side of the soul, is an emanation from the Sephirah of foundation, that element of divinity which comes most of all into contact with the material forces of earth. To sum up the matter in general and on technical language, the three divisions or aspects of the human soul enable man to fit himself into the plan and framework of the cosmos, give him the power to do his multifarious duties towards the multifarious portions of the world which is a manifestation of God's thought, a copy of the celestial universe, an emanation of the divine. The Zohar puts it rather poetically as thus: in these three, we find an exact image of which is above in the celestial world. For all three forms only one soul, one being, where all is one. The Nefesh, the lowest side of the soul, does not in itself possess any light. This is why it is so tightly joined to the body, acquiring for it the pleasures and the foods which it needs. It is of it that the sage says, "She giveth meat to her household, and their task to her maidens." Proverbs 31:15. Her household means the body, which is fed. Her maidens are the limbs which obey the dictates of the body. Above the Nefesh is the Ruah, the ethical soul, which dominates the Nefesh, imposes laws upon it, and enlightens it as much as its nature requires. And then high above the Ruah is the Neshama, which in its turn rules the Ruah and sheds upon it the light of life. The Ruah is lit up by this light and depends entirely upon it. After death, the Ruah has no rest. The gates of paradise, Eden, are not opened to it until the time when Neshama has reascended to its source, to the Ancient of the Ancients, in order to become filled with him throughout eternity. For the Neshama is always coming back again towards its source. It can be gathered from this passage, as from many similar ones which might have been usefully quoted had space allowed, that Neshama is only realized, that man only becomes conscious of Neshama after death. A whole lifetime is necessary, and in some cases more than one lifetime, as we shall see, Gilgum, in order that Neshama should be able to mount up again to the infinite source from which it emanated. And it is inevitable destiny of Neshama to climb back and become one with the Ancient of Ancients. End quote. But if Neshama is so exalted, so sacrosanct, why should it have emanated from its immaculate source at all to become tainted with earth? The Zohar anticipates our question and gives us an answer as follows, quote, "If thou inquirest why it, the soul, cometh down into the world from so exalted a place, and putteth itself at such a distance from its source, I reply thus. It may be likened to an earthly monarch to whom a son is born. The monarch takes the son to the countryside, there to be nourished and trained until such a time as he is old enough to accustom himself to the palace of his father. When the father is told that the education of his son is completed, what does he do out of his love for him? In order to celebrate his homecoming, he sends for the queen, the mother of the lad. He brings her into the palace and rejoices with her the whole day long. It is thus with the Holy One, blessed be he. He too has a son by the queen. This son is the high and holy soul. He conducts it to the countryside, the world, in order to grow up there and gain an acquaintance with the customs appertaining to the royal palace. When the divine king perceives that the soul has completed its growth, and the time is ripe for recalling it to himself, what does he do out of his love for it? He sends for the queen, brings her into the palace, and brings the soul in too. The soul, forsooth, does not bid adieu to its earthly tenement before the queen has come to unite herself with it, and to lead it into the royal apartment where it is to live forever. And the people of the world are wont to weep when the soul takes its leave of them. But if there be a wise man amongst you, he says to them, Why weep ye? Is he not the son of the king? Is it not meet that he should take leave of you to live in the palace of his father? It was for this reason that Moses, who knew the truth, on seeing the inhabitants of the earth mourning for the dead, exclaimed, Ye are the children of the Lord your God. Ye shall not cut yourselves, nor make any baldness between your eyes for the dead. Deuteronomy 14:1. If all good men knew this, they would hail with delight the day when it behooves them to bid adieu to the world. It is not the height of glory for them when the Queen, the divine presence, comes down into the midst of them to lead them into the palace of the King to enjoy the delights for evermore. End quote. It should be noted, by the way, that there are many instances in Talmudic literature of men seeing the Shekinah at the hour of death. It is the signal of the return of Neshama to its home, the oversoul, of which it is but a loosened fragment, and the return can only begin after it has completed its education within the life limits of its earthly body. Not only does the Zohar, as we have seen, teach the emanations of a threefold soul, but it also propounds a curious theory about the emanation of a pre-existent form or type of body, which, in the case of each one of us, unites the soul with the body. It is one of the strangest pieces of Zoharic psychology extant, and the object is probably that of accounting, on one and the same ground, for the varying physical and cyclical characteristics embedded in each of us from birth. The passage from the Zohar runs as follows. At the moment when the earthly union, marriage, takes place, the Holy One, blessed be He, sends to earth a form or image resembling a man and bearing upon itself the divine seal. This image is present at the moment just mentioned, and if the eye could see what goes on then, it would detect above the heads of man and wife an image like a human face, and this image is the model after which we are fashioned. It is this image which receives us first on our arrival into this world. It grows in us as we grow and leaves us when we leave the world. This image is from above. When the souls are about to quit their heavenly abode, each soul appears before the Holy One, blessed be He, clothed with an exalted pattern, or image, or form, on which are engraven the features which it will bear here below. End quote. But of far greater consequence in the history of Jewish mysticism is the commanding place assigned by the Zohar to the idea of love. Indeed, Jewish mysticism is here but a reflection of the nature of mysticism inherent in all other creeds. The soul's most visible, most tangible, most perceivable quality is love. The soul is the root of love. Love is the symbol of the soul. Mystic love, says Mist Underhill, is the offspring of celestial Venus, the deep-seated desire and tendency of the soul towards its source. The soul, says the mystic of all ages, seeks to enter consciously into presence of God. It can do so only under the spur of an overpowering ecstatic emotion called love. Although, according to the Zohar, the soul is the most exalted state of neshama, which can only enjoy the love inherent in its union from its source after it has freed itself from the contamination of earthly bodies, it is nevertheless possible, under certain conditions, to realize this ecstatic love while the soul is in the living body of an individual. One of these conditions is the act of serving God, the chief outward commitment of which is prayer.
Metatron, Angelology. In examining Philo's mysticism, all that can be dealt with, and this very fragmentarily and inadequately, are certain points in the mysticism of his Logos idea, which, by reason of their affinity with the Haggadah, are important to an understanding of Jewish mysticism. How to bridge the chasm between God and the world, how at the first creation of man it was possible for God, who is the all-holy and all-perfect, to come into contact with imperfect man, is an oft reoccurring subject of speculation in the Talmud and Midrashim. The cosmogony of Genesis comes in for an exceptionally elaborate treatment. In this connection, it is only to be expected that angelology should figure largely. Theologians are quite wrong when they say that post-biblical Judaism removed the deity further and further away from the world, and then tried to bring him nearer again by the medium of the angel. The truth is that God was in many senses brought very near, and the angel was but an aspect of this, quote, nearness. God was immanent as well as transcendent, and the angel was a sort of emanation of the divine, an offshoot of deity, holding intimate converse with the affairs of the world. It was on these lines that the rabbis solved their problem of reconciling the idea of a pure God with an impure world. God did not really come into contact with the world, but his angels did, and his angels are really part and parcel of his own being, emanations of his own substance. This was, of course, far from being a logical solution, but the rabbis, like many other religious thinkers of those early centuries, were not masters of logic. Philo's ideas run in what seems a similar groove. All matter is to him evil. Hence, God must be placed outside the world. But through this was his philosophy, his religion. Judaism taught him otherwise. Obliged to find some way out of the difficulty, he hit upon the idea of the logi, the divine agencies, which, while being in some senses inherent in God, are in other ways and at various times exterior to him. It would be incorrect to say that he derived this theology from the rabbinic sources. Platonic and Stoic teachings are largely responsible for them, but Philo endeavored to bring them into line with rabbinic modes of biblical interpretation. He felt that he ought to give them a Jewish dress, with the result that much of what he says about divine powers, agencies, attributes operating in the world independently of deity and yet as part and parcel of him, bears a close resemblance to much of the rabbinic angelology and rabbinic teaching about the divine attributes. Thus, to give some examples, the rabbis in Genesis Rabbah 8, 3, 4, and in many other places are at pains to justify the usage of the grammatical plural in the words, and God said, "Let us make man." Genesis 1:26. Various opinions are thrown out, but the finally accepted view is that, quote, "At the same time when God was about to create the first man, he took counsel with the ministering angels." End quote. What this interpretation aims at is to relieve the deity of the blame for the evil in man and to place it upon some other's shoulders. But what it really does is to show that the earth is the scene and center of divine agencies. Angels are emanations of the divine, working here below. Man is in a double sense made by them. It was they who had a hand in his creation. It is they who fill his environment and make him realize that he is ever in the grip of a presence from which there is no escaping. The Talmud and Midrashim overflow with the descriptions of vast hierarchies of spiritual intelligences, angels who guide the will of man and the course of nature, surrounding man on all sides and at all moments, shielding him and lifting him up to higher planes of thought and feeling. They protect the pious and help them in their transactions. Every angelic host consists of 1,000 times 1,000. The angels give instructions in certain matters. Every man has a special guardian angel. All this literature of angelology can have no possible meaning at all unless it is interpreted to mean that God is present and active in the world, a power behind phenomena, a directing mind, a controlling will, an immanent God. Philo's doctrine is similar. Thus he says, quote, "For God, not condescending to come down to the external senses, sends his own words, logi, or angels, for the sake of giving assistance to those who love virtue. But they attend like physicians to the diseases of the soul, and apply themselves to heal them, offering sacred recommendations like sacred laws, and inviting men to practice the duties inculcated by them, and like the trainers of wrestlers, implanting in their pupils strength and power and irresistible vigor. Very properly, therefore, when he, Jacob, has arrived at the external sense, he is represented no longer as meeting God, but only the divine word, just as his grandfather Abraham, the model of wisdom, did." End quote. On Dreams, Part 1, 12. In another passage in the forementioned section, he speaks of the immortal words which it is customary to call angels. Again, take the following quote, "But these men pray to be nourished by the word, logos, of God. But Jacob, raising his head above the word, says that he is nourished by God himself, and his words are as follows: The God in whom my father Abraham and Isaac were well pleased, the God who has nourished me from my youth upwards to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all my evils, bless these children. This now, being a symbol of perfect disposition, thinks God himself his nourisher and not the Word, and he speaks of the angel, which is the Word, as the physician of his evils. In this speaking most naturally, for the good things which he has previously mentioned are pleasing to him, inasmuch as the living and true God has given them to him face to face. but the secondary good things have been given to him by the angels and by the word of God. On this account, I think it is that God gives men pure good health, which is not preceded by any disease in the body, by himself alone, but that health which is an escape from disease, he gives through the medium of skill in medical science, attributing it to science, and to him which can apply it skillfully, though in truth it is God himself who heals both by these means and without these means, and the same is the case with regard to the soul. The good things, namely food, he gives to men by his power alone, but to those which contain in them a deliverance from evil, he gives by means of his angels and his word. End quote. Allegories of the Sacred Laws 362. The intermingling of Greek and Hebrew elements in these passages is curious, but the two sets are easily distinguishable. Two things are clear from these quotations. Firstly, the angel is a kind of representative of the deity among mortals. It is a sort of God in action. God is very near man and not transcendent. Secondly, the angel and the logos, word, or logi, words, have very much the same nature and fulfill very much the same function. The rabbinic mysticism clustering round angels, as well as the rabbinic doctrine of the Shekinah, which will be dealt with later, have likewise many points in common. Angels encompass the worthy Israelite. The Shekinah likewise accompanies Israel, nay, even dwells in the midst of impure Israelites, as a famous passage in the Talmud says. But there are aspects of Philo's angelology which are strange to rabbinic modes of thought. One of the most interesting of these is his designation of angels as incorporeal intelligences and as immortal souls on Dreams 120. The rabbis obviously thought of angels as material beings. They even at times materialized the Shekinah as well by mentioned in the following chapter. The sight of an angel was a physical phenomenon. Philo's exegesis took quite a different turn. Thus, in a lengthy comment on Genesis 28:12, and he dreamed a dream and beheld a ladder was planted firmly on the ground, the head of which reached to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. He goes on to say, this air is to the abode of incorporeal souls, since it seemed good to the Creator of the universe to fill all parts of the world with living creatures. For the Creator of the universe formed the air so that it should be the habit of those bodies which are immovable, and the nature of those which are moved in an invisible manner, and the soul of such as are able to exert an impetus and visible sense of their own. Therefore, let no one deprive the most excellent nature of living creatures of the most excellent of those elements which surround the earth, that is to say, of the air. For not only is it not alone deserted by all things besides, but rather like a populous city, it is full of imperishable and immortal citizens, souls equal in number to the stars. Now, of these souls, some descend upon the earth with a view to bring bound up in mortal bodies, but some soar upwards, but others, condemning the body of great folly and trifling, have pronounced it a prison and a grave, and flying from it as from a house of correction or tomb, have raised themselves aloft on light wings towards the ether, and have devoted their whole lives to sublime speculations. There are others again, the purest and most excellent of all, which have received greater and more divine intellects, never by any chance desiring any earthly thing whatsoever, but being, as it were, lieutenants of the ruler of the universe, as though they were the eyes and ears of the great king, beholding and listening to everything. New philosophers in general are wont to call these demons, but the sacred scriptures calls them angels, using a name more in accord with nature, for indeed they do report the injunctions of the father to his children, and the necessities of the children to the father. End quote. On Dreams 122. From this passage, the following deductions seem to be obvious. Firstly, one large department of the Philonic angelology is utterly strange to Talmudic and Midrashic exegesis. An angel as an incorporeal soul is more akin to the Aristotelian doctrine of intelligences, the intermediate beings between the prime cause and existing things. The general level of the rabbinic conception of the angel is well characterized by the following passage. When Samael saw that no sin was found amongst them, the Jews, on the day of atonement, he exclaimed before God, O thou sovereign of the universe, thou hast one nation on earth, resembling the ministering angels in heaven. Just as the latter are barefooted, so are the Israelites barefooted on the day of atonement. Just as the angels neither eat nor drink, so do the Israelites not eat or drink on the day of atonement. Just as the angels do not skip about, so do the Israelites stand unmoved upon their feet the whole day of atonement. Just as peace reigns in the midst of the angels, so does peace reign in the midst of the Israelites on the day of atonement. Just as the angels are free from all sin, so are the Israelites free from sin on the day of atonement. God hearkens to the advocacy of Israel from the mouth of their arch accuser, and he grants his atonement for the altar, for the sanctuary, and for the priests, and for all the people of the congregation. This quotation is from the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, a curious midrashic work belonging to the 9th century AD. It seems to summarize all the best points in the angelic lore of the Jews in the preceding 9 centuries. The naivete of the whole rabbinic outlook is very apparent and is ever so far removed from Philo's incorporeal soul. In fact, Philo's systemic division of angels into higher and lower grades is foreign to the rabbinic speculations, which are largely without any system whatsoever. Foreign also is his view of angels as souls descending upon the earth, with a view to being bound up in mortal bodies. The angel in rabbinic thought is never inside anyone. But in the second place, it is obvious to the student of medieval as distinct from the Talmudic and Midrashic mysticism that there is an affinity between the Philonic treatment of angels and the treatment of the subject by such famous Jewish theologians as Saadia Joseph, Judah ha-Levi, Solomon Gabriel, Abraham David, and Moses Maimonides. They too, like Philo, were influenced by Greek thought. They were either Aristotelians, Platonists, or Neoplatonists, so that what amount of influence came to them directly from the works of Philo is a matter that calls for deep research. To the first named theologian, Saadia, there is, like to Philo, something immaterial, something ethereal, unearthly about the angel. While being external to man, it is in a sense internal too. Saadia being of opinion that they were visions seen during prophetic ecstasy rather than outward realities. See his philosophical work, Faith and Knowledge, 2:8 and in 4:6. That Gabriel should develop a more mystical line of thought than this is not surprising, seeing that he is dependent in many of his essential teachings upon Plotinus. The words of Judah ha-Levi are worth quoting here. He says, quote, As for the angels, some are created for the time being out of the subtle elements of matter, as air or fire. Some are eternal angels, existing from everlasting to everlasting, and perhaps they are the spiritual intelligences of which the philosophers speak. We must neither accept nor reject their words. It is doubtful whether the angels seen by Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel were of the class of those created for the time being, or of the class of spiritual essences which are eternal. Quote, "The glory of God is a thin, subtle body, produced by the will of God, and which forms itself in the prophet's imagination in the way that the divine will directs. This is, according to the first, similar explanation, but according to a second, more complex explanation. The glory of God denotes the whole class of angels together with the spiritual instruments, the throne, the chariot, Merkaba, the firmament, the Ophanum, and the spheres, Galgalm, and others besides, which belong to the things which are eternal. All this is implied in the term glory of God." End quote. Further on in the same paragraph, Judah Ha-Levi brackets together as having one meaning the phrases glory of God, kingdom of God, and Shekinah of God. Maimonides speaks on the subject thus in Guide of the Perplexed 2:6. The angels are not corporeal. This is what Aristotle also said, only there is a difference of name. He calls them separate intelligences, whereas we designate them angels. Moreover, when he says that these separate intelligences are also intermediaries between the Creator and existing things, and that through their means the spheres are moved, the motion of the spheres being the prime cause of all being, this is also written in all books, because you will not find that God does any deed except by means of an angel. The movement of Balaam's ass was done by means of an angel. Even the elements are called angels. The term angel is applied to a messenger of men in the phrase, "And Jacob sent messengers," malachim, in Genesis 32:3. It is applied to a prophet, as in the phrase, "And an angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum," in Judges 2:1. It is the term used of the separate intelligences which are seen by the prophets in the prophetic vision. It is the designation also of the vital powers, as we shall explain. Maimonides takes a rabbinic apothegm together, such as, "God does nothing without previously consulting his heavenly or upper host," or, quote, "God and his court of justice have taken counsel together over every limb in the human body and have put each in its rightful place," end quote, and is at pains to show how these statements must not be taken literally to mean that the deity asks advice or seeks help, but that what they convey is that the term angel stands for the powers embodied in all earthly phenomena, the world forces which are outflowing of God and represent the aspect of the divine activity in the universe. Paradoxically enough, Maimonides is rationalist and mystic at one and the same time. While striving to strip the Hebrew scriptures of the supernatural and the miraculous, he exhibits his strong belief in a world impregnated with traces and symptoms of a divine life. But let it not be thought that Philo's logos and logi and his angelology are nothing but symbols of abstract thinking on the ways in which the deity participates in the affairs of men and of the world. It has been mentioned a little above that the rabbis often materialized the Shekinah and gave strongly definite personality to their angels. There is one respect in which Philo followed a similar line of exposition. He too gave personality to his logos, personality as understood in Philo's time, and very different from our modern ideas of personality. Not alone does he speak of the Logos as the being who guided the patriarchs, as the angel who appeared to Hagar, as the cloud at the Red Sea, as the divine form who changed the name of Jacob to Israel, but he also describes him as a suppliant to the immortal God on behalf of the mortal race which is exposed to affliction and misery, and is also the ambassador sent by the ruler of all to the subject race. Quote, from who is heir to the divine things. 42. He is an attendant on the one supreme being. He is a paraclete, for it was indispensable that the man who was consecrated to the Father of the world should have as a paraclete his Son, the being most perfect in virtue, to procure forgiveness of sins and a supply of unlimited blessings. From the Life of Moses 3:14. The resemblances between these teachings and much of the mysticism of Paul, as well as of the author of the fourth Gospel, John, are unmistakable, and whether they show borrowing or are explicable as belonging to modes of thinking current in that age is a mute point. But what strongly concerns our presentation of this subject is the fact that this branch of Philinic theology is mirrored in the early Jewish as well as in the early Christian teaching about God, but with this considerable difference, that whereas some of the cardinal doctrines of Christianity are embedded in these ideas, their significance for Judaism was, at no epoch, vital. They belong to the literature, not to the faith of the Jew. They were ever for the few rather than for the many. It is to the figure of Metatron that we must turn for the counterpart in rabbinic mysticism, to the personified Logos of Philo. Behold, I send an angel before thee, to keep thee in the way, and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him, and obey his voice. Provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Exodus 23:20. This angel in whom God's name exists is, said the rabbis, Metatron. And why so? Because, said they, the numerical value of the Hebrew letters composing the name Metatron are 314, which corresponds with the comprising of the word Shaddai. Shaddai means Almighty, one of the divine appellations. This is a typical illustration of the rabbinic mysticism clustering round arithmetical numbers and the divine names. My name is in him. For example, the name Almighty is comprehended in the name Metatron, and the divine name is not merely a grammatical part of speech. It is a kind of essence of the deity himself. Hence, the essence of the deity exists in Metatron. He is God's lieutenant. He represents the active phase of deity as manifested in the universe. The command to, quote, beware of him and obey his voice, end quote, failing which he will not pardon your transgressions, forcibly brings out the intercessory powers of Metatron. In the Midrash Tanhuma, on portion Wa Eth Hanan, it is graphically related how Moses, when he knew that he must die, implored all the different parts of creation, the sea, the dry land, the mountains, and the hills, to pray that he might live. But they all refuse. He finally betakes himself to Metatron and says to him, seek mercy for me that I may not die. But Metatron replies, O Moses, my master, why troublest thou thyself thus? I have heard behind the veil that thy prayer for life will not be heard. Metatron confesses that his intercession would be vain, but yet, and here is a great point, the Midrashic passage in question states that immediately after, the anger of the Holy Spirit grew cool. Metatron did not succeed in securing a prolongation of life for Moses, but he managed to turn away divine wrath from him. The title, quote, Prince of the Presence, from Sar Ha-Panim, as well as Prince of the World, Sar Ha-Olam, is often applied to Metatron, a striking passage again depicting Metatron not alone as a pleader for Israel, but as taking upon himself the sorrow for Israel's sins, is as follows. Introduction to Lamentations, Rabbah 24. Quote, no sooner was the temple burnt than the Holy One, blessed be He, said, now will I withdraw my Shekinah from it, and I will go up to my former habitation. As it is said in Hosea 15, I will go and return to my place, till they acknowledge their offense and seek my face. At that hour the Holy One, blessed be He, wept, saying, woe is me, what have I done? I caused my Shekinah to abide below for the sake of Israel. But now that Israel has sinned, I have returned to my original dwelling place. Far be it from me that I should be a derision to the nations and a mocking to all creatures. Forthwith, Metatron fell upon his face, exclaiming, O sovereign of the universe, let me weep, but weep thou not. The title Prince of the Presence or Prince of the World denotes Metatron's active interference with the happenings of the universe. T.B. Yabamoth 16b has the extraordinary saying, no one but the Prince of the World could have uttered verse 25 of Psalms 37. I have been young and now am old, yet have I not seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. What else could have said this? Could God have said it? Does old age apply to God? Could David have said it? Was he advanced in years when he composed this psalm? No one else but the Prince of the World could have said it. End quote. Two important ideas are enshrined here. First, Metatron's existence is made to date from the creation. A kind of pre-existence is accorded him, and the doctrine of pre-existence, or rather pre-existences, is a ubiquitous element in the old rabbinic treatment of cosmogony. 7 things preceded the creation of the world: the Torah, the divine throne, the temple, the name of the Messiah, paradise, hell, and repentance. Whether Metatron ought to be an 8th or is to be identified with one among these 7 is a point for further research. Secondly, Metatron speaks words of worldly wisdom garnered from an intimate experience of contact with the multitudinous facts and phases of earthly existence. He knows men as no one else could know them. He resembles in this respect the strongly personified wisdom of the Jewish Alexandrian literature. Like it, he is given a sort of prime part in the cosmic process. The Aramaic commentary, Targum, on Genesis verse 24, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him, renders the name Enoch by Metatron, and just as Enoch in the Apocrypha Book of Jubilees 4:23, or 2nd Enoch 53:2 appears as the heavenly scribe, so Metatron is often described in the Talmud and Midrash. See T.B. Hagiga 15a. The idea of fundamental to both these branches of literature is probably the same, that Metatron is a link uniting the human with the divine, the bridge over which the knowledge of what is passing here below is brought to the realms above, and over which, in return, the divine concern for men and the world passes down to the scenes of earth. A truly poetic rendering of this divine concern is given in the Talmud, where God is described as giving instruction a certain number of hours of every day to prematurely deceased children. Aboda Zara 3b, quote, who instructed them in the period previous to their death, end quote. So the question runs, and the answer is Metatron. On this understanding, Metatron is the helper to the deity. He, as it were, takes up the divine work at points where its omnipotence cannot, if one may say so to speak, reach. Not even the smallest meanest child need be forsaken of God, so long as Metatron is its guide and instructor. Metatron has been identified with the Zoroastrian Mithra. It certainly possesses features resembling Philo's logos. It has also much in common with the theology of the early Gnostics. In all probability, it is the result of a fusion of all of these systems of thought. The same can be predicted of more than one other branch of rabbinic angelology. Noteworthy, however, is the fact that though the Jews could get so far as to bring themselves to look at Metatron in the light of a heavenly co-worker with God, a kind of semi-divinity having an access to the deity in a measure utterly unique, yet so extraordinarily uncompromising were their notions of the divine unity that as far as the religion of their daily life was concerned, God alone was God, and Metatron was ignored. His name figures somewhat in certain departments of Jewish liturgy. He plays a role in medieval Jewish mysticism of the Kabbalah, but the stringent, inelastic emphasis on the idea of safeguarding the divine unity, an emphasis rarely appreciated by the non-Jew, could brook no recognition of Metatron in the sphere of the Jews' most intimate religious concerns. One other dominating characteristic of the Jewish Hellenistic mysticism is to be found in the functions assigned to the idea of wisdom. The grand preliminary to this branch of doctrine is to be found in the Old Testament in Proverbs 8:22 to 31. Quote, the Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. When there was no depths, I was brought forth. When there was no foundations, abounding with water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills, was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world, when he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the foundations of the deep, when he gave to the sea his decree, that the waters should not pass his commandments, when he appointed the foundations of the earth. Then I was by him, as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the habitable part of his earth, and my delights were with the sons of men. Wisdom. Wisdom is the quality through which God acts in the world, and by the instrumentality of which the deity is known to man. It is in the passage just quoted, personified and objectified. It dwells among the sons of men and finds its special delight in intercourse with them. It resembles the divine Pneuma, or spirit of the Stoic philosophy, which too is given a prime part in the cosmic process. The rabbis, it is interesting to notice, made much of the phrase as one brought up with him. The phrase is represented in the original Hebrew by one word, Amun, but slight alliterations in the vowing they extracted three meanings from it. 1. Pedagogue, 2. Pupil, 3. Workman. Thus, One, wisdom, which they identified with the Torah or law, was the schoolmaster, the tutor in the divine household, giving guidance to his divine master in his plans for the creation of the universe. 2. Wisdom was the pupil or child of the divine, according to rabbinic teaching. A pupil stood to his master in the position of a child to a father, hidden away by reason of its preciousness in the lap of the Father until the time when it became a gift to a newly launched universe. And 3. Wisdom was God's workman or servant in the work and administration of the universe. And yet, in spite of all of this obvious and strong personification, wisdom is but a quality belonging to God, one of his attributes by which he makes himself known and felt in the world of men and in human hearts, one of the elements in the divine nature which is most in sympathy with the innate tendency in man to go on striving ever upward and onward. It is after all only God's wisdom, no matter how near an approach to personality there may be in the various descriptions of the term. It is a potency wholly in God, and yet at one and the same time wholly out of God. It is an embodiment, a revealer of one aspect of divine spirit. As has already been remarked, the Jews always vindicated the unity of God, no matter into what dubious fields his theological speculations otherwise led him. The apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon shows forth similar mystical elements. Quote, "For wisdom is more mobile than any motion, yea, she pervadeth and penetrateth all things by reason of her pureness." 724. This is the Stoic conception of the immanent Neuma. Again, for she is a breath of the power of God, and a clear effulgence of the glory of the Almighty. This seems to be rather the language of Platonism. So is the following pronouncement of the soul's pre-existence. For I was a witty child, and had a good spirit. Yea, rather, being good, I came into a body undefiled. Section 8:19. Platonic, too, is the notion of earth and matter pressing down the soul. Quote, "For the corruption of the body presseth down the soul, and the earthly tabernacle weigheth down the mind that museth upon many things." End quote. Section 9:15. Wisdom is man's anchorage in time of trouble. It is the eminent protector and redeemer of mankind. Wisdom becomes a personality. Wisdom is given over to this theme. It is identified with the Word, the quote, Word, which dominates the prologue of the fourth Gospel, and which is very similar in sense, appearing in the rabbinic mysticism as Debur, Ma'amar, or Memra. Quote, "For while peaceful silence enwrapped all things, and night in her own swiftness was in mid-course, thine all-powerful word, leaping from heaven out of the royal throne, a stern warrior into the midst of the doomed land, bearing as a sharp sword thine unfeigned commandment, and standing it filled all things with death, and while it touched the heaven, it trode upon the earth." The Word in this extraordinary pronouncement holds the idea of the divine energy as distinguished from divine love, which is operative in all things and which links the transcendent Godhead with his creative spirit, creature with creator, man with man. End quote. Evelyn Underhill, The Mystic Way, page 223. Truly enough, the passage breathes what seems an unedifying spirit of revenge and bloodthirstiness, but it is explicable as an echo of the Old Testament idea of the God of righteousness who hates wickedness and slays the wicked. Divine justice energizes in the world. It is embedded in the scheme of the cosmos. It brooks no evil. It recognizes nothing but uprightness and truth. This idea of an antagonism between an immanent God and sin is, as will be seen in our next chapter, a feature of the rabbinic conception of Shekinah. In Exodus Rabbah 28 and 29, the divine voice at the revelation on Sinai deals out death to the idolaters. Similarly, the Targum, Aramaic paraphrase of the Old Testament, renders the Hebrew for, quote, "and my soul shall abhor you," end quote, from Leviticus 26:30 by, quote, "and my memra shall remove you afar," end quote. The memra here is the avenger of the wayward Israelites. The Jewish Hellenistic wisdom, the word of the fourth gospel, the memra of the Targumic literature, the Shekinah of the Talmud and Midrashim, all point, though in somewhat different ways and degrees, to the great fact that the world of matter and of spirit is the scene of the immanent manifestation of divine wisdom, divine power, divine love, divine justice.